I'm Nick Burns, professor here at the Kennedy School. Welcome to IDEASpHERE. We're very pleased all of you are here with us today. We've been looking forward to this for a very, very long time. And today we thought in this panel we'd focus on a very big issue, a central issue for the United States and for the American people. What kind of power are we going to be in the world in the next 50 years, in this century? What kind of role will we play? Professor John Eikenberry of Princeton has a marvelous way of thinking about this. He says there is an international system, and the United States has been, since the end of the Second World War, the system operator, the predominant military, political, economic, organizing force in the world. And the big question, of course, is do we still have the capacity to play that role? And do we have the will to play that role going forward? And to help us think through this issue, we've got four terrific colleagues, all from this school and friends. David Ignatius is a senior fellow at the Kennedy School. He is a columnist for the Washington Post. I think he is the most influential foreign policy columnist writing today. His access into the Obama administration, his years of experience on American foreign policy, it makes him a must-read columnist. So tomorrow morning, read the Washington Post. He's got a column in there. I won't tell you the subject. He may give you a preview tonight, but it's going to be a great column. David is a Harvard College graduate, so a long association to Harvard. He taught here 2 years ago, and we really value his presence here as a senior fellow. He's also a spy novelist. And so I think a lot of you have probably read some of those novels.
You read the book, it's good.
9 books, I think.
Especially the sex scenes, right?
To his right, Graham Allison, founding dean of the Kennedy School, founder of the Belfer Center, more than anyone else, the person who built this school, conceived of it, and brought it to fruition. I keep telling him this. I think he wrote In Essence of Decision, the most important political science book that I ever read in college, explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he's just gone on to do lots of different things, like trying to figure out in the 90s how to engage with the Russians, the post-Soviet Russians. And he built a big focus on that here, and of course served in the Clinton administration as Assistant Secretary of Defense on that issue, on the former Soviet Union. And more recently has turned his attention to China, and he'll talk about that tonight. To his right, Meghan O'Sullivan, Kirkpatrick Professor of Public Policy. Meghan is an extraordinary force at this school. She's I think, one of the foremost experts now on the changing energy picture and the energy revolution worldwide that is having a big impact on the balance of power. She talks, writes, thinks a lot about that. She's a Middle East expert. She was our Deputy National Security Advisor for both Iraq and Afghanistan, in the middle part and the most difficult part of both wars in the Bush administration. And she's also just recently been one of 2 negotiators on Northern Ireland with her friend and colleague Richard Haass of the Council on Foreign Relations. So great to have Meghan with us. And finally, our great friend.
And she came back from Basra yesterday.
Came back from Basra yesterday, exactly right. Our great friend David, Professor David Gergen. David, as all of you know, advisor to 4 presidents. I'm not sure anyone has the breadth of experience working in the White House on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democratic Party. I first met David when we both worked for President Clinton in the White House in the early 1990s. You all know him from CNN. You should know him for the Center of Public Leadership here at the Kennedy School. He's built this terrific center. And yesterday hosted Tony Blair for a discussion on leadership, and then last evening hosted Doris Kearns Goodwin for a conversation about 5 American presidents. David's built a center that encourages our students to think about leadership in their own careers in private and public sector. So we couldn't have a better panel for this subject. Here are the rules of the road. I'm going to ask each of them a different question about American leadership and the future of American power in the world. And we'll go through one by one, starting with David Ignatius, those questions, get those views. Then in a second round, I'm going to ask each of them the same 2 questions, and I'll let you know what those questions are about the future. And then we'll turn it over to you, and we'll invite your questions and your point of view as well. So I want to start with David Ignatius, because he's traveled the longest distance, today at least, Meghan the longest yesterday to get here. David, covers the White House, student of Middle East politics, student of American foreign policy. How does President Obama think about American power? A Democrat might say, I don't know if he did say, we're the indispensable power. Republicans say, and challenge Democrats to say, no, we're the exceptional power in the world. How does President Obama view our power, and how do you think he's doing at a very difficult time of change and transition with China rising in the exercise of American power?
First, I want to say how wonderful it is to be back at the Kennedy School. I think you have to be a journalist and have spent your career, waiting outside people's offices and nodding as they say crazy things and taking notes to appreciate what it's like to be called Professor Ignatius. Being at Harvard, being called professor was a real change of life for me. I think President Obama gave us a very clear window on how he would answer the questions that Nick put when he was asked in Manila to defend his foreign policy record, and said with what many people thought was disturbing candor that he saw his role as president as hitting singles and doubles, not many home runs, that often he felt that the best thing to do was to avoid making mistakes, to be careful. He asked, what is it that my critics who want me to use military force really are thinking about? What do they mean by that? They want to keep repeating the mistake of Iraq, the president said. I was told after that that if you want to know what the man really thinks, that's it. That was really from his gut. And if anybody was in any doubt, he went to Los Angeles, I think it was last week, and spoke at an event organized by Steven Spielberg, and again, in this very direct way, talked about how difficult it is to be president in foreign policy, that he sees Syrian children dying, he sees these Nigerian girls kidnapped, and he wonders, what can I do as president about these terrible problems? And his answer is, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how best to use force. I have a lot of sympathy for somebody who sees prudential management of national security as a priority. One theme of the course that I taught here with Graham's and Nick's blessing was that policymakers operate in what I called, this was about the Arab Spring, the Arab Revolution, the fog of revolution and the fog of policy making as you try to respond to it, where you know, as in the fog of war, you don't really know where you are. You don't know what the consequences of your actions are. You don't know where others are on this space, and you know, what if you do X, you know, what the follow-on consequences of that will be. And you can see, as President Obama has tried to make a policy on Ukraine, that caution in this fog. What is Putin up to? How does he think? Where's he going next? How do we reduce the possible damage to ourselves and our allies? How do we keep our responses within the realm of what's realistic and practical? And so, you know, as I said, I have sympathy for the president's dilemma. That said, the conclusion that I've reached, that I've written, is that the United States, in part because of the perception that the president is not aggressive, is not decisively acting in response to foreign policy issues, has suffered what I call reputational damage. Many of you in your business lives know what reputational damage is and how consequential it is. Once you lose it, it can be very difficult to get it back. And I fear that we're in that situation now. One of the terrible things about being perceived as a weak president is that a lot of the things that you'd be tempted to do to show that you're strong are not sensible, would not be wise decisions to make, but you sometimes feel a need to act and show that you're acting. I asked a senior Pentagon official at lunch this week how he balanced the need to make Ukraine policy without provoking Putin and Russia to do things that would be difficult for the U.S. to respond to. that would make a bad situation even worse. And I must say, a lot of the advice that Obama gets strikes me as it would have the effect of making a bad situation worse. How he balances that need to be careful against this problem of reputational damage and the military consequences of that for the United States in a period where our military resources are stretched, our ability to be flexible, agile in the use of military power is limited. And suffice to say, I didn't feel I got a good answer to that question. And I don't feel that the White House and the government as a whole is doing a good job in getting that balance right. I see the cautious, avoid provoking side, but I don't see people stepping up to the reality that there's been reputational damage. I should note, because Nick asked me to speak to this world that I try to cover as a journalist, that this foreign policy team under the president, I think, is weaker than he had during his first term. And it's important, I think, going forward that the president recognize it. I'm thinking, was talking today with Graham about how to write about that issue as a columnist. But if you look at each of the key positions, Secretary Hagel, one of the nicest people in Washington, is nothing like the manager that we had in Bob Gates or in Leon Panetta at the Pentagon. I was with Bob Gates on Face the Nation last weekend, and as I said when we were commenting on what he'd said, wow, that makes you remember what it's like to have a secretary who really is tough, who demands accountability, and who will fire people if he doesn't get the accountability. Bob Gates scared people, and in part for that reason he was an effective manager. Leon Panetta was a more political person, but he was also an effective manager, aided by Ash Carter of this institution. Hagel, I think, is still tarnished from his very rocky confirmation process. Secretary of State John Kerry, I've been a big fan of John Kerry. You know, this sort of indefatigable secretary, go anywhere, trying to pursue the impossible. Nick mentioned my column tomorrow. It's about how the peace process that Secretary Kerry attached his reputation to has collapsed really quite disastrously. We really are worse off now than when we started. The gap between the parties is wider now than it was. The mistrust is greater. I mean, that's really a problem. It's a problem for the U.S., a problem for Israel, it's a problem for the Palestinians. So although I've been enthusiastic about Secretary Kerry, that's becoming an issue. And then finally at the NSC, Tom Donilon was so low-key, so self-effacing, you know, the gray man in a sense, but he was a very good process manager. And I think that Susan Rice is having trouble matching that success in keeping the complicated machinery of national security going in the right direction. So I would note all of those team aspects under the president as problems. In the end, this is about President Obama. It's about his personality, about his reticence. One of his top aides said to me, and I'll conclude with this, early, maybe a year and a half into his first term, said, you know, I think President Obama would rather be a Supreme Court justice than President Johnson. And this was somebody who was working with him every day, in intimate contact with him. I think a lot of people looking at him would probably make a similar comment today. So, well, let me end it here. We've got a lot from other people, and Nick, I'm sure, will be back to me in another round. But that's a starting point in thinking about Obama.
We will. David, thank you very much. And we're definitely going to come back to this, and I'm sure that David Gergen is going to pick up on a lot of what you've said. Fascinating conversation last night with Doris Kearns Goodwin about Taft and TR.
Exactly.
Making the same comparison. And we'll want to come back to this issue. I guess everyone's trying to play armchair psychologist. Did President Obama overlearn the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan? Has he pulled back too much from the throttle? In our second round, I'll ask you that question. But Graham, I want to turn to you. And Graham has been such a great leader and a great friend to me. I want to thank him publicly for that. Thank Bob Belfer for what Bob has done to support everybody in this center. This is the Belfer Center. You're at ground zero. Graham has begun to turn his prodigious attention to China, this big challenge. And I guess I'd set up your question, Graham, by saying, how do we balance two difficult sides of an equation? On the one hand, we're going to be China will be our most important partner on trade, on economics, on climate change, on global stability. On the other hand, we're already competing for military strategic power in Asia and maybe elsewhere. How do we both be a partner, very close, and yet be a competitor and not end up in a catastrophic situation that we've seen too often? And you've reflected, you've talked to Lee Kuan Yew. How do you see this?
First, let me say again, what a pleasure it is to be on the panel with such fantastic colleagues. I'd say for those of you who don't spend your time here at the Kennedy School, and in the Belfer Center in particular, since that's where most of us come from, but David, fortunately, is part of our family, and we're part of his family at the same time. See what I would say it's a great opportunity to have such colleagues and to have them drilling down from different angles on such complicated subjects. So I think actually the topic that David has opened up would be more than enough for us, but I'll resist and answer the question that you put. So clearly the defining challenge for the rest of our lives will be the rise of China and the Chinese-U.S. relationship, which Nick rightly says has got this inescapable mixture of necessity for cooperation, if we're to succeed on the one hand, and serious competition on the other. So that's just built into the situation. And so I'm not a China expert at all, but the last half dozen years, I've been trying to learn about China. And we actually have an extraordinary group of people at the Kennedy School now in a budding project that's emerging, but where Tony Sach at the Ash Center has been the leader, though he focuses mostly on the inside of China. And Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister from Australia, has just recently come to the Belfer Center, spending half of his time here now, working on the China project. So we have Larry Summers and I have a China working group. We meet every week or two with China experts, trying to just get our head around the thing. So several years ago when I was working on this, I was having trouble kind of getting a picture of what's going on. And I coined a metaphor, so-called Thucydides' trap, to remind us that historically, when a rising power rivals a ruling power, watch out. In 11 of 15 such cases, when a rising power rivaled a ruling power, in the last 500 years, the outcome was war. So if you were just a statistician, you would say, this is not going to turn out well. Okay? So what to say about this? First, everybody here obviously knows about the rise of China. But if I gave you a quiz, as I often do the students in class, about have you realized the extent to which China has risen so far, so fast, on so many dimensions of power? So a country that in 1980, so that's in all of our mental lifetimes, had an entire GDP smaller than Spain's, grew an increment last year bigger than the entire GDP of Spain. So that was just the growth. If you compare 1980 and this year, in 1980, what percentage of US GDP was China GDP? 6%. 6. Today, 2/3. Next decade, 1+. So actually, if you do it in purchasing power parity, under the most recent calculations, China is already the #1 economy, but in real dollar exchange rates in the next decade. Okay? Trade, 1980, China, 10% of world trade. 10% of China's world trade, 10% of US. Today, 150. Reserves, 1980, China's reserves relative to US, 6%. Today, 600. We could go on and on. In the period since the financial crash of 2008, what percentage of all the growth in the world is accounted for by China? That's a question. 40. 40. Almost half of all the growth in the world. So you look and you say, whoa, wait a minute. Okay. So never in history has a state risen so far, so fast, on so many different dimensions. So second point, historically this is trouble. So Thucydides was a famous Greek historian, 5th century BC. He wrote famously, it was the rise of Athens and the fear that inspired in Sparta that made the war inevitable. I won't give you my lecture on Thucydides, but it's worth to go look at and to read again. It's an amazing story. At the end of this, two city-states, which had been a burst of civilization, Athens in particular, something never seen before in the world, had managed to destroy each other. And the Persians, we call them now Iranians, had come back to rule them. So rising power, ruling power, watch out. If here the 100th anniversary of 1914, a lot of people are thinking about 1914. And it's one of the cases that in the study that we've looked at. In 1914, the rise of Germany and the fear that inspired in Britain created a structural stress that contributed powerfully to a sequence of events in which the murder of an archduke by a Serbian terrorists cascaded into a global war, at the end of which Europe, which had been the center of civilization for 1,000 years, was finished. Okay, third point. Why can't China be more like us? Americans love to give lectures to foreigners about why if they would just be like us, things would be, fine. And I would say, be careful what you wish for. So when the US emerged as a leading world power about this time 100 years ago, so just about the same time Germany is rising, the first couple of decades of the 20th century, we were coming into what Teddy Roosevelt, who was the personification of this, a famous Harvard man whose picture you can see here on the wall of Harvard presidents. Okay? He declared this was going to be the American century. And he looked around and said, what in the world are the British doing in our hemisphere? So at the time, the British ruled the seas. And they had provided 100 years of free security to the US from European developments because of their navy. But he said, well, there's a territorial dispute in Venezuela. The British are saying they want to arbitrate. He said, what do they have? Why are they here? What do they have to do with this conversation? They're out. So he threatened war both with Britain and with Germany unless they would let him resolve it. Okay? In Canada, go look at this fat tail of Alaska. So Alaska is this big blob, and then there's a fat tail. It's a wonderful long story, but that fat tail came to be American and separated Canada from the seas because there was a territorial dispute. Teddy Roosevelt had heard from the guy that did the forests. Was the
Gifford?
Sorry?
Of the
naturalist, Muir Woods, John Muir. Muir had told him that Tsongas National Forest, which is now American, was 100 Yosemites. He wanted to see it, but he said, in any case, it's ours. Okay? So Taft actually said to him, we should arbitrate this. And he said, absolutely not. This is American territory. So he finally made a compromise with Taft. He said it could be arbitrated by a panel of 5 if he could appoint 3. They had one meeting. They gave it to him. That's it. Okay. So we hope that they're not Teddy Roosevelt. Finally, likely does not mean inevitable. So actually, when Thucydides said that made the war inevitable, he meant very, very likely, not really 100%. So 4 of the 15 cases, things turned out better. And in the study that I've been doing, I'm trying to see what clues we can get from, well, both what cautions we can get from the cases that turned out badly, but also what clues we can get from the cases that turned out better. So the U.S. rose at about the same time the Germans, and the U.S. and Britain did not get into a war. Now that was greatly helped by the fact that the British had two rising powers that they had to deal with, and one of them was a lot closer to home. But nonetheless, if you look at the accommodation that was required of the British, it was a huge accommodation. And changes of attitudes and actions in general, in success stories, are required more of the ruling power than of the rising power. So that's not good news for us as we try to think of in relation to China. Xi Jinping, finally, the president of China, has picked up this metaphor. So he likes, in January, he gave a speech about Thucydides' trap, in which he has announced his mantra is, quote, new form of great power relations, by which he means some way that you can manage this cooperation competition without war. And what Kevin Rudd's project here at the Belfer Center is doing is trying to say, under this banner, because Chinese have these kind of banners or slogans, what would be the operational content of a, quote, new form of great power relations that would allow you to escape war?
Thank you. So what we have so far is we have questions about American leadership in a transitional phase where others are rising, China's rising, but suddenly, because of shale gas and oil, will that arrest the falling from grace of the United States? Is it one of the ways we can kind of rebuild our power for a new century? Meghan.
Thank you. And let me add my words of welcome to all of you. And it's always great to see Bob Belfer and be on a panel with some of my favorite colleagues. I worked on Afghanistan and Iraq for a very long time, so it's so exciting for me to be the good news person. It's a nice change. This is a topic, the energy revolution that has been happening in the United States. This is a topic that I've been working on here at a research project that I run called the Geopolitics of Energy Project. And we look broadly at the intersection of international politics and security and energy changes. So it encompasses this, but it goes beyond it to look at issues of China's energy growth, look at Latin America and Russia and Europe, and a number of things that I don't have time to touch on. But I will be speaking on this topic tomorrow morning at greater length if it's of interest to you.
What time?
What time?
10 a.m. in the NI conference room. I'll be with my colleague Holly Morrow, who is a China and Asian energy specialist, and so we'll be talking about that. Though I won't spend a lot of time describing what this energy revolution is, because I think you're probably somewhat familiar with it. You've heard the debates about fracking, but I'd like to just give you a couple of statistics, as Graham did, to put it into context, that basically for decades, America has always thought that its dependency on external energy, on imported energy, was its huge Achilles heel. And it was a huge vulnerability. If you look at assessments that the CIA, the National Intelligence Council have done, they always talk about that being a real weakness. And in kind of formulating American grand strategy, that dependency on external energy was always a major component. And suddenly, lo and behold, in the last 7 years, we've moved from a position where energy was our Achilles heel to a position where actually we're now able to talk about energy being a real strength. And that has been because technologies and the combination of technologies have made vast amounts of oil and gas commercial. We knew that resource was there, but we didn't have the ability to produce it at an economical, in an economical way, and now we do. And so over, again, a very short period of time, I'd say in the last 7 years or so, we've gone from looking at a future where we would be importing huge quantities of natural gas every year to a situation where we're virtually self-sufficient, and there's a very active debate about us exporting natural gas. And on the oil side, the results have been similarly astonishing and in an even shorter amount of time. Just in the last 3 years, the United States, thanks largely to this technology, the United States has increased its production of oil the same amount, just the incremental production, the same amount that Kuwait produces every day, or the UAE produces every day. That's a big incremental production. We're not self-sufficient at this point, but we're certainly far less energy import dependent than we were. So this has all kinds of interesting implications for economics. But it also has interesting implications for the question that we're discussing in this panel, which is American power. And I'll just very briefly mention kind of three baskets that I use to think about the areas in which this has been helpful to boost American power, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to discuss them more generally if you're interested. The first is that this energy revolution has really influenced the perception of America abroad. You think about how commonplace the narrative of American decline has become. And this kind of, what I just described to you very briefly, really flies in the face of American decline. That again, you know, a vulnerability, now a strength. And if you look at other big powers, with the exception of Russia, they're all headed in the opposite direction, and particularly China. China is soon going to be more dependent on external energy than America ever was. So, you know, you have China acutely feeling this vulnerability, and America kind of, you know, America's now able to rid itself of that vulnerability. I think that changes the conversation on the margins in some ways, but in an important way. Now, in the Middle East, this changing perception is not necessarily positive. As Graham mentioned, I just came back from Iraq a day or so ago, and I spent a couple of days in the UAE, and people are very nervous about America losing interest. We'll talk about that in greater depth, but certainly when you ask them, well, why do you think America is losing interest? They say, well, you don't need our energy anymore. Now, for all kinds of reasons, which I won't go into, but we can later, it really, the fact that we no longer will need to import Middle Eastern energy doesn't mean that we don't have serious interest in the Middle East, but certainly the perception of many Middle Easterners is that we no longer have to be as committed to security there as we have been over the past decades, because energy is no longer the real critical part of that relationship. The second basket, I would say, is that this energy revolution creates some serious challenges for many of our adversaries. You know, I used to always qualify Russia as an adversary when I talked about it, but now I feel pretty comfortable grouping them in that adversarial basket. And, you know, there's many, many ways in which this new dynamic is actually challenging Russia's really long-term business model on energy. Russia is hugely dependent on gas and oil for its national budget, for its external revenues, its foreign exchange, all of those things. And the model that Russia has used in selling its gas to Europe has been challenged by the fact that America no longer needs to import gas. So there's a lot more gas out there looking for a home, and that's created pressure on the contracts that Russia has relied on for so long. So that's created insecurity on that front. It's also forced the Russians to look east, to think about, you know, maybe we actually need to capture markets in the east. And so if you watch closely on the 23rd of May, so just next week, you have the presidents of Russia and China meeting, and I expect there's a high likelihood that they're going to announce a big energy deal, which really wouldn't have happened, I think, without this unconventional revolution. I've talked about it. Certainly, we could talk about Iran and how increased American production gave the world more scope to impose sanctions on Iran, because it wasn't so frightening to kind of push away some of the Iranian oil from global markets. There wasn't so much nervousness about a price hike that could happen if Iranian oil came out the market, because there was so much new American production. And it's possible that depending on what happens with the price, that countries like Venezuela will really feel the crunch as well. And just to wrap up, I'll say the third basket, so I talked about first, influencing perceptions, second, posing challenges to our adversaries, and thirdly, I would say there's a whole number of ways in which this energy revolution provides opportunities to the United States. And I'll just mention two in brief. The first is we've noticed, or we've talked a lot about, is America in a position to alleviate some of European dependence on Russia? This is actually quite a complicated answer, and it boils down to it depends, like so many things do. But certainly there are prospects. It will require policy. It will require people actually thinking about energy as a strategic asset, not just letting the markets take care of it or existing policies take care of it. But it's possible that the U.S. could help create some extra space for the Europeans. It won't replace Russian gas, but it could create a little bit more breathing room for the Europeans. It could create more breathing room for the Japanese, who are, of course, still managing the fallout of Fukushima. And the last opportunity I'd mentioned is that with China. I actually think about everything that Graham is saying and wonder, where are the points of potential cooperation between the U.S. and China in the coming years? And I think that there's, at least two possible areas that are deeply connected to this energy revolution. The first is developing China's own domestic shale gas. China's believed to have more shale gas than the United States has, but it has really struggled to kind of bring it online in the way the U.S. has. So I think there is an opportunity there for the U.S. and China to work a little bit more closely together to see that China is able to develop these resources, which I think will be good for China, but it'll be good for the world, particularly because it'll be good for climate. And then secondly and lastly, I think there's an opportunity for China and the United States to cooperate in the Middle East. As America is less and less dependent on Middle Eastern oil, China is more and more dependent on Middle Eastern oil. By 2030, 90% of oil from the Middle East will be going to Asia, and most of that going to China. And so if you think about the idea that the American Navy is going to be protecting the Gulf, keeping the Straits of Hormuz open in order for oil to move from the Middle East to China isn't going to sit that well with Americans. And so I think there'll need to be more burden sharing. And that's something that I think China is, that doesn't really sit particularly well with them right now, because like many people depended on Britain for so long, they're very comfortable depending on the United States to provide this role. But I think over time, in the decade ahead, that there will be a need on both sides to work a little bit more closely together, because we'll both have very serious interests in the stability of that part of the world.
Thank you, Meghan.
Thank you.
David, you get the challenge of integrating domestic and foreign policy. And do you see that we are being buffeted by neo-isolationism, left-wing the Democratic Party, right-wing the Republican Party? Will there be a consensus in Washington in both parties that we should be leading with a strong military and a strong State Department as well?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Decisive.
Yeah, exactly.
Explain,
Thank
please.
you. And I'm delighted to join this panel. I do think it represents a new spirit of collaboration that is spreading across the Kennedy School in a very happy way. Just to report on that, Nick and I have been working together on two projects. One with to bring a new fellowship program and research program on the Middle East to the Kennedy School. We've come a long way on that effort together. And secondly, we're jointly working on a project to provide leadership and management training to women from the Middle East. And I think you'll be hearing more about watch that space, but I think you'll be hearing more about that in months to come. But together, I think it's been really a lot of fun for two old colleagues to get together and try to make these things. And I think in the same spirit, it's good to notice that here at this tonight, we have Bob Belfer here, who has been such a wonderful benefactor for the Belfer Center with his family. And then we also have Les and Abigail Wexner, who have been wonderful benefactors for the Center for Public Leadership. And we have other donors from both sides here. So it's good. It's a good evening, a good occasion for the school. I come at this conversation as a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist. And I'll just talk about the more pessimistic side for a moment, and then we can turn to building on what Meghan has just said. I was curious, Graham, whether you think we ought to be unleashing shale gas in China. Is that in our national interest? I'd like to come back to that at some point. Let me tell you, I think the outlook for the United States politically as a governing power and as a power in the world over the next short while is not encouraging. We've had 7 presidents since World War II who have either been in their second term or have come into power and have been elected to a final term in the past. Since World War II, we've had 7. The first 6 all enjoyed either support from public opinion in the Congress or a permissive environment in which they could act. And that's been very, very important, from Harry Truman, who had many of his best accomplishments after he was elected in 1948 in his final term. You can run the gamut. Doris Kearns Goodwin could do a better job of this, but if you look at Reagan in his second term, working with Gorbachev, there were breakthroughs. There have been breakthroughs with a number of presidents. And what that has traditionally meant is that a second-term president follows an arc of power, if you want to call it that way. And that is, they usually have a small window, about a year, to get things done domestically in their second term. And then midterm elections approach, people start getting much more partisan. And after the midterms, people are looking over the shoulders of a president to see who's coming next. And so in those last 3 years, they tend to turn to foreign policy. And with this supportive or permissive environment, they've gotten a lot done. And they racked up a lot of achievements in that second term. President Obama finds himself in a very, I think, unique situation, and it's not one that's good for the country, frankly. He is perilously close to becoming a lame duck for the rest of his time in office. He still has 33 months in office. It's really, really important for the country, for him personally, but it's important for the country and for the world, that we have a president who's capable of governing and of acting overseas and getting things done. We have too many issues that are crowding in on us in the short term that are threatening to security and stability and to economic growth. And for a variety of reasons, I think he finds himself now in his own trap, and that is public opinion is definitely in retreat about America's position in the world. You saw this Pew study that came out a short while ago. 52% of Americans think we should mind our own business internationally. Basically, they are in a neo-isolationist mood. It's the highest number we've seen on that question in some decades. So that he does not have a public that would encourage him to be an activist president overseas. Did not want to go into Syria. Does not want to go and do anything really tough on Ukraine. And he has a Congress that is not at all permissive. In fact, is denying him some of the tools that he needs to get some things done on the international side. Most importantly, Joe Nye would argue that if the rebalancing or the pivot to Asia is going to be work, central to that whole policy is the pursuit and then the conclusion to a trade agreement. The TPP, as it's called, is now hanging by thread because the president does not have trade authority, and the Congress won't give it to him. And I don't see how he completes an agreement without being able to assure others that the agreement that is struck won't be changed or modified or slashed by this Congress. And that puts him in a very, very weak negotiating agreement position, and I think that likely he won't get it. Look at all the humping and the delays with regard to the IMF and trying to reapportion power there within the IMF. It's not scandalous, but it is very, very destructive. That the Congress is holding back from him the tools I think he needs to be effective on some fronts and a second term. And then there's also, of course, the issue of his own approach to foreign policy and the team. I agree with the comments that have been made so far about the quality of his team. In his second term, the quality was much better. I thought it was striking what Graham had to say about, or no, I think it was Nick had to say about an aide saying he would have preferred to have been on the Supreme Court. And it was David Ignatius. Thank you. Yes, David, that was really interesting. This is worth the whole column. And as Nick pointed out about in the conversation about Taft versus Teddy Roosevelt, one an ineffectual president and the other one of our great presidents, her central argument, Doris's central argument, is that Taft did not have the temperament to be a strong, effective president. He had the temperament of a court justice. And whereas TR loved power, relished power, and used it very, very muscularly. And I think we do find, to some extent in that comment about the Supreme Court, I think we find there's a resonance with the whole Taft question that I find very, very striking. I don't think, these folks know better than I do. They travel more than I do to talk to international capitals, but the international folks I talk to, both in this country and overseas, are worried that we have a pattern of what seems to be psychological retreat, and both in our public opinion and in the way the president has approached foreign policy. We heard the term from David about prudential management of foreign policy, and in many ways it is wise to be prudential, but what we need is prudential leadership, and there's a difference. You know, one is just sort of keeping things going, the other is trying to reshape a very volatile world with a lot of uncertainty, and to try to provide a sense of anchoring that's going to be very, very important for security and for economic growth. And I think right now there's a sense of passivity that the economists cover of not long ago, this last couple of weeks, about what will America fight for. It raises very specter of the Americans have moved from being a reckless nation under Bush to being a passive nation under Obama, and we can't seem to get the right balance from the international perspective. Now, this is not new. I remember some years ago, David, you would appreciate this. You know, remember Joe Kraft as a columnist. David is an heir of Joe Kraft. He was a marvelous columnist about foreign affairs, and he used to make the argument about the Europeans. They either think we're too aggressive and too much in their faces, or we're too passive and we sit back too much. We're not holding the world together. You can't get it. You'll never get it right with the Europeans. That's just in their nature. So they're always going to be critical of us. But I think there's a lot of truth to that argument right now. And frankly, I think we're stuck for the next 33 months or so with it, because it's not going to get any better after the midterms. The big question politically is, can the next president get us out of this deadlock? And what we find in politics right now, of course, is that this president, sadly, is people are looking over his shoulder already, and everybody's in a position of waiting for Hillary. You know, this is almost unprecedented to be waiting for the next person this way. But the question becomes, I think she's by far and away the most likely choice, but the question becomes, can she govern in a different way? Can she pull us out of this? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's one of the big questions that will be hanging over the next 3 years.
Thank you, David. I think David Ignatius and David Gergen have been good bookends to bring us integrate politics in Washington with foreign policy. We've got 20 minutes left. We want to give you at least 15, so I'm going to challenge in a lightning round my colleagues to answer these maybe two questions simultaneously in your response. What about this pulling back too much on the throttle that David Ignatius and David Gergen have talked about, that maybe the president doesn't have a coherent strategy, he's not leading strongly enough? The Republican right is criticizing him for that, but a lot of Democrats are also saying that. And I was in China, Brazil, and Netherlands in the last 2 months, heard it in all three of those very different countries. Where is American power? It's very striking to hear this from foreigners after having served with Meghan in the Bush administration. So what do you think about that? And a prediction from all of you. Despite all the troubles we've talked about, looking at our political, military, economic power, our soft power, will we still likely be, in any case, the predominant global power 2 decades from now? Lightning round, starting with David Ignatius.
Nick, I'll answer your question about power and retreat by posing my own question, which is the issue that I have been struggling with for the last couple of years. Graham and I have even talked about trying to do something here about it, is how the United States should project power effectively in this era after our expeditionary wars, where we used full-blown military force in Iraq and Afghanistan with, let's be honest, a much more limited effect than people expected. Americans saw that and are frustrated, angry in many cases, but the world saw it too. So I think the idea that we should just go back to the old template and say, why isn't the president projecting power? And no. I mean, that's the whole point, is to think of some new ways. This president is not a very good commander-in-chief. He is a pretty good covert commander-in-chief. He uses the tools of covert action the raid to kill Osama bin Laden is the most obvious example, but there are others, pretty effectively. I hope he is finally turning toward an effective paramilitary covert assistance and training program for the Syrian rebels, as much to keep al-Qaeda in Syria at bay as to change the regime there. I think this is a real priority. So I'd answer Nick's first question by saying, how should we project power? You know, in 2 sentences, answer the second question. Warren Buffett likes to say, you know, people usually make a mistake betting against the United States. And he's right. I mean, you know, at any point in our history, there were lots of moments where you'd say, oh, it'll never work out, and it does. So you know, I'm going to say that 30 years from now, we'll still be the dominant power. But I am struck by the fact, to me, that the most effective, successful leader in the world in the last year has been Xi Jinping, who brilliantly has gone after his problems, who identified corruption in the party elite, sort of decentralization, fragmentation as the real danger to continued rule by the party in China, and has just gone at it hammer and tongs, going after the leaders of the security apparatus, people you think would be untouchable. So, you know, that is a leader as effective as we're saying, we're all kind of agreeing President Obama has been ineffective. So that makes me temper my optimism.
Thank you. David, Graham.
So on the overlearn the lessons of Afghanistan and Iraq, I would say that's mainly a bum rap, okay? Mainly a bum rap. Mark Twain said about Wagner, he said the music is better than it sounds. So I would say historically, American president or statesmen have been reluctant to use military force. In fact, it used to be said that military force was the last tool, the last resort. So the notion, the kind of presumption or expectation that if there's a problem out there, if you just sent American military force, you would make it better, I think is historically mistaken, and I think it's been recently mistaken. So whenever I translate this to people and students in class, I say, don't even use these nice euphemisms, sending American military force. This is called sending fellow young men and women to kill and to die. That's what it's about. Right? So we take Iraq. 10 years of war, $3 trillion, 5,000 dead. Is it better off from American interests than before? I think not. Not. Okay? Afghanistan, 12 years of war, 2,000 dead, $1 trillion. It's better off for Americans than before? No. Libya is another good case. Here, the French foreign minister Tuesday got my dander going, where he's saying, oh my God, we wanted to attack in Syria, but obviously we couldn't do it alone, so we wanted you to come with us, and it was Obama's fault that we didn't go and attack the Syrians. I would say, screw you. You could do this yourself if you want to. What's preventing you? Nothing. You don't need our permission. The answer is, well, but somebody has to make it a permissive environment. You have to take down the air defenses first, because it would be dangerous to go there if we had to go by ourselves. The same way with Libya. I would say, excuse me, Libya is close to you, but in the Libyan case, are we better off than we were before? I don't think so. So I'd look and say, in Syria, we would be better off if we had attacked rather than this miracle from the sky in which the chemical weapons, 90% of the chemical weapons have been eliminated not by attacking them, but by agreeing. So I look and I think, Ukraine, boy, now there's a case we could make better so the economist piece even I thought was dumb, okay? Who will we fight for? Sam Nunn and I were talking about this afternoon. His daughter, a Kennedy School graduate, is the front runner for a Senate seat in Georgia today. So we were asking about this, talking about it. I said to her, Tim, tell her to go to the next meeting with her group and say, I'm going to tell you 3 unbelievable things, and 2 of them are true, but you have to figure out which ones. 1, America is committed to send Americans to kill and to die for Latvia. That's true or false. Second one is Americans are committed to kill and to die, to come to the defense of Japan over some islands that are in the East China Sea called the Senkakus. And the third is Martians landed in Nevada yesterday. Now, can you figure out which one of these is least plausible? Well, I would say a little bit of reserve is not a bad thing.
Okay. And
oh, sorry, and will we be
yes.
20 years from today? I think, as with David, I always quote Warren Buffett, nobody made money selling you a short in the long run, and I'm a Yahoo from North Carolina, so I couldn't even imagine that. But if you were a Martian strategist looking at events in the last decade, you would say either you're waiting for a miracle, and miracles happen in the U.S. That's the way we've got out of most of the messes, previously. But unless there's a miracle, I would say no. Yeah.
No to U.S. being the predominant.
Yeah.
Meghan.
Great. Graham, I'm going to so resist the desire to respond to you, but I look forward to it later. And let me just take that question, though, that you picked up on that Nick had mentioned earlier. Has this administration overlearned the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan? And what I would say there is, first, we shouldn't assume that there's any consensus on what those lessons are. That actually that's something that's still, that's work that remains to be done. And I would say that President Obama has probably learned, in my mind, there'll be people here who disagree with me, has learned the wrong lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan. I really feel that the administration, the big lesson that they took away from our engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan was that the United States cannot influence the trajectory of events in the Middle East. And that's the big takeaway I think they got. No matter what we do, things are going to move along some trajectory that we can maybe influence things temporarily at the margins. I don't think that's the real lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan. I think the real lessons boil down to something along the lines of we can influence events in the Middle East. However, it requires enormous resources, incredible patience. And then the second lesson, I would say that there is a limited role for military force in changing societies, but not a completely, zero role for military force. And so I think that's where I would fault the administration on thinking that we're actually powerless to affect change. And I think that has led to the kinds of policies where we've seen where we haven't really been engaged in Syria. And a lot of people have just argued, at least I've heard from the administration, well, there's nothing we can do that can really fundamentally change the outcome here. On the second question about will the United States be the dominant power in 2 decades, I would say, to keep it brief, to the extent that that question even makes sense in 20 years, who is the dominant power? I would say the U.S. is certainly the most likely candidate. I would kind of leave it at that.
Thank you. David Gergen.
Sure. I hesitate to disagree with my distinguished colleague from a fellow North Carolinian. But Graham, it's a false choice to say that we have to either choose war or passivity. Certainly there are things we can do in between. Even Bob Gates, the first Secretary of Defense for President Obama, I thought one of his finest appointments. He has said that the Western response to Syria was feckless and that the Western response to the Ukraine has been anemic. And this is from a friend. So I do think there were things we could have done that were tougher, that would be more engaged, that would help us. Now, as to the longer term, I'm very optimistic about the longer term. Graham knows this far better than I do, but if you look at China, they've got a lot of problems of their own. For one thing, they're going to lose, they're getting old. And they're going to lose 1/3 of their workforce by 2050 because as people get older. And it's often said that China is going to get old before it gets rich. So you have to look at it on one side, what their issues are, but on the other side, what gives me great encouragement about the American future is it comes from, it's rooted in an argument that Klaus Schwab made here recently when he visited the Kennedy School from the World Economic Forum, and he's another Kennedy School graduate, as you know. And he said the way you really ought to judge a country's future is not by its GDP growth rate, but by its degree of innovation. And that is a much more important standard for what you're going to see. And this remains the most innovative country in the world. I think most people now agree with that. And it's innovation that brought the revolution in energy that Meghan has been talking about, both by the government. The government played a very important role in that research, but also by the private sector that brought these new technologies on and made this possible. And you can look at a variety of other fields, whether it's robotics, artificial intelligence, 3D manufacturing. You can go through the list. The Economist had a couple of years ago a big package on innovation. They had on the cover a Stradivarius violin. It was just sitting there in the air, floating in the air. And I looked at it with some puzzlement. I don't usually talk about Stradivarius violins, not part of my daily conversation. The last time I really thought about one seriously was when our daughter got married. My wife Anne is here. And our daughter got married, and you have the distinct sense when your daughter gets married, every one of you will experience this, when your daughter gets married that you're giving away your Stradivarius to an orangutan. But that Stradivarius was made by 3D manufacturing, and we have the corner on that. The fact that we have 17 of the top 20 universities in the world is a huge, huge asset for us. So as long as we can keep Harvard #1, you make those payments, hey, and we'll be okay.
Okay, thanks to my four colleagues for a great discussion.